Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Ray Dogum, and welcome to VibeCast. VibeCast is VibeBio's very own podcast where we explore some of the hottest topics in drug development, investment strategies, and technology innovation. Join us to learn, imagine, question, and help us identify and develop solutions together. Our guest today is none other than Rahul Chaturvedi, the founder and CEO of Clora, a platform where people go to discover and build on-demand life sciences teams. Prior to founding Clora in 2017, Rahul successfully led the development activities for over 20 phase 2 and 3 programs that have resulted in 6 product approvals to date. He also hosts Biotech 2050, a podcast chronicling the development of life sciences industry with distinguished biotech leaders. Rahul, it's always great to speak to a fellow podcaster, and I'm excited for our conversation today. Would you mind telling the community a little bit more about yourself, your background, and what got you interested in biotech?
Yeah, Ray, thanks for having me. It's a trip to be on the other side of these recordings. So let's see how this goes. Thanks for the intro. Prior to founding Clora, background is entirely on the clinical development side. For quite some time, I was working with the team over at Flagship Pioneering to help get a new up and running where we were looking to effectively drug and modulate the microbiome. And then prior to that, I was leading clin dev at a handful of biotechs across a range of therapeutic areas and treatment modalities. I had the good fortune of working on some product approvals for programs that I had been leading, which was tremendously rewarding. But then also had a bunch of failures along the way, just like what is normal across biotech, given how much risk there is in drug development. And that led me to really think about, what's the right operating model for biotech, given how capital intensive drug development can be, and also given only, one in roughly 8,000 drugs actually make it to patients at the end of the day. So that was really the driving force behind founding Clora and thinking about how do we decrease the cost of development, de-risk it, and also just accelerate the path to getting it in front of patients.
That's awesome. And yeah, as you mentioned, there's a lot of shifts happening in the biotech space, specifically when it comes to personnel and, executives and trying to find the right people for your team. And we'll get into that in the episode, I think, specifically maybe how remote working and virtual teams are maybe challenging the way traditional biotech has usually worked. Before that, I'm just curious, what motivated you and Alok, our CEO at VibeBio, what motivated you guys to start this podcast, Biotech 2050? And what unique perspective do you bring to your audience?
Yeah. So Alok and I had, become friends over the years, and he always served as a sounding board for me as I was navigating early startup life. Since he had done it a couple of times. And, really both of us were thinking about particularly this next generation of up and coming biotech leaders and how do we provide them access to the best and brightest across biotech and really the access that I think both of us wish we had when we were up and coming in biotech. By no means I'll speak for myself, by no means have we arrived, but really, thought about, I wish I could talk to lots of CEOs and drug development experts about frameworks that they have adopted, just evolution of their own mental models around how to get a biotech up and running and what true entrepreneurship looks like for founder-led biotechs. And that was really the impetus. We looked around and didn't see a whole lot of great content out there that was approachable for this next generation of up and coming biotech leaders, dating back to pre-pandemic 2019 or so, and that was really it. Is building something for the community where folks had access to all the wonderful professionals that are willing to commit their time to sharing their knowledge and their experiences with the rest of the biotech sector.
And I think you've done a great job, both of you, in kind of relaying that message to the community. And I think the title itself, Biotech 2050, really says a lot. Like, this is something that will take time. And once we maybe hit 2050, it'll be a completely different world potentially because of some of the advancements that are being made today. So it's very interesting, to listen to. And I recommend anyone listening here to check out that podcast as well, if you haven't already. Is there something that you want to share, maybe the most surprising thing you learned about or from running your podcast?
Yeah. The biggest takeaway for me particularly with a number of the entrepreneurs that we've had on the podcast. So we've had, roughly 180 or so episodes so far, is how non-obvious the path to a CEO in biotech is. And everyone has taken such different paths to get to where they are. Some have seen tremendous success, have sold their companies and then gone back and started it all over again. Or otherwise they're first time founders, or perhaps even from other spaces like the tech sector. And now they've somehow fallen into running a biotech. And that's really it is, hopefully it's inspirational to folks that are listening that, irrespective of your background, you can do what a lot of these folks that have been on the podcast have done. I think that's the thing that has resonated the most with me.
Over 180 episodes. That's pretty incredible. Any memorable interviews that you can share for the audience here?
Yeah, sure. So let's see. Some of the best ones, Paul Biondi from Flagship Pioneering was great. Ankit Mahadevia has been on a couple of times. He just published a book about being an introverted leader. And then he also talked about Spiro Therapeutics as a company that he co-founded. That was a great one. I know you and I have shared some guests like Michelle Werner from Alterna. That was a great one. I listened to the one that she did with you as well. So she's always a really compelling speaker with a very interesting background. So those are some of the ones that come to mind.
Switching gears here a little bit. I'm curious now. Let's talk about Clora. So what is your vision for Clora?
So some background for folks, just as it relates to biotech and where biotech is right now. I thought about the idea quite some time ago. And the reason I thought about the idea was, as I mentioned, I had worked on a handful of approvals, but also a bunch of failures along the way. And in many ways, we've continued to be in this golden age of scientific innovation across biotech and pharma and medical devices and diagnostics and so on. Yet we continue to apply operating models that hadn't innovated for decades. And I think that was really the mismatch for me. Was we're doing a lot of amazing stuff as it relates to scientific innovation, but we haven't really figured out how to evolve how we operate at the same pace as those scientific innovations. And I think that requires a different approach. And so, just some context. Generally, it takes 10 plus years to bring a single asset to market. There's over 300 unique skill sets required to bring a single drug to market. And what's so unique about the biotech industry is that the work in biotech tends to be somewhat episodic. So given how heterogeneous and specialized talent tends to be in biotech, imagine if you're going from early stage discovery to then running preclinical programs, to then getting into the clinic, you need a very different team around you to be able to effectively get you from point A to point B to point C. And so that's long been the nature of work in biotech. But the approach we've often seen, particularly over the last couple of years, when there was a lot of capital flowing into biotech, was that we somewhat forgot about how much risk there is in development and started to scale teams really prematurely. And so you'd have companies that have raised, $200-300 million rounds. They're 4 or 5 years away from the clinic, but yet they have teams of 150 and so on. And now what we're seeing is some of the downstream effects of that sort of approach, which is, a lot of programs have failed as we thought they would. And now we've had this wave of layoffs hit biotech, where there's been 700 plus companies that have had gone through the painful process of laying off their teams. And there's, and culture takes such a hit when you have to go through rifts like that. And so really started to think about, well, what's a more agile model for biotech, where we don't necessarily need to hire all of these folks full time, but yet we can still access the best talent in the world in an on-demand fashion, and really augment our teams with kind of a hub and spoke model, and then turn on and off resources as we need to. And then if a program fails, then you still have kept fixed costs relatively low. You can turn off certain resources and then move on to another program. And really drew inspiration from a lot of other sectors, and even if you think about the Ubers and the Airbnbs of the world, where you have a ton of demand on one side and a lot of supply on the other side, how do you match the two sides together, but layer in the inherent complexity in drug development? And then many other sectors, particularly the tech sector, the finance sector, healthcare, have done a really good job of developing kind of marketplace models that match supply and demand much more effectively. Really thought about bringing that sort of model to biotech, given all the dynamics that I just described.
That's very interesting, and thanks for explaining maybe the new operating model that biotech could function under. And you
Yeah.
mentioned how it takes up to 10 years or more for a drug to reach the clinic, and maybe even like a billion or $2 billion, right? Do you think using this new operating model, the Uberification of life sciences experts, do you think that will actually work to shorten the time it takes to reach the clinic, or is that sort of a difficult thing because a lot of these drugs need to go through clinical trials, and that just takes time? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or does it
I'd say
depend on like the disease area? Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think a lot of those factors come into play, Ray. I think, it'll take a while for us. We have several customers that we've been working with that have partnered with us from the early days, from early stage IND enabling studies that are now getting close to approval. And we've heard, hey, look, we've been able to operate so much more efficiently as a result of a model like this, and also not overly rely on third-party providers that we weren't crazy about. CROs now have a turnover of 30 to 40% year over year. And so it's this revolving door when we work with some of these external providers. And so from that perspective, I think it's led to far more efficiency in development. And I think kind of equally important is sometimes early stage biotechs don't have access to the best talent that's out there. And the best talent is at much more mature companies, et cetera. So this is really a way for early stage biotechs to tap into to folks that have been there and done that, and not make the same mistakes that other companies have made as well. And hopefully the downstream effect of this is, if we're able to shrink development timelines, decrease the risk of development through models like Clora, but also, application of AI, et cetera, is then hopefully we are able to make significant headway in terms of reducing the cost of new medicines to patients as well. And that'll take quite some time to prove out. But that's the hope. And that was really the driving motivation for me, is how do we decrease development timelines, get a far better conversion rate from early stage development to getting to approvals, and then downstream that the overall cost of new therapies is reduced as well.
You mentioned how, the recent layoffs could be creating this cultural problems within organizations. I guess my question is, could you share some of your best practices for helping biotech companies maintain and nurture their talent once they've hired them?
Biotechs, there's a dichotomy here. I think there are a number of biotechs that do a wonderful job of making sure everyone is bought into the culture and the mission behind why this is so important as it relates to patients, and directly exposing their teams to those patients so they understand firsthand what they're trying to solve. And I think there's other biotechs that that tend to focus a lot on pushing development at any cost. And I think we've seen a dilution of kind of trust across those teams as it relates to their leadership. So, I think the same old principles apply. So nothing new here in terms of, being transparent, making sure folks are motivated and you're hiring the right folks, and you're able to make decisions quickly when it's not working out. But I think much more importantly is empowering your team, given the background that I just talked about, for leaders across your team to be able to run and keep that long-term vision in mind as it relates to everything that you're doing. And now, as it relates to fractional talent, it's a somewhat new concept for many people. Is, hey, we have a full-time team, but we have this extension of our team as well. And there's a couple of companies that I've been really impressed with in terms of how they've carried over their culture with their full-time team, with external partners and consultants, or even third-party providers like CROs as well. And I think that's really, it starts from the top down. When you think of these augmented teams, not as uh, something that's a arm's length away, but rather really an extension of you, and making sure everyone has that mindset and they're treating folks the right way in terms of having one-on-ones, making sure they understand what the long-term vision is and why they're working their butts off, and how and why really aggressive timelines are so important given the competitive nature of everything we do. I think those are some of the best practices that I've been really impressed with, particularly um, as a result of the pandemic, and some of those some of that mindset carrying through post pandemic as well. I think there a number of biotechs have gone back to having everyone in the office, let's say 4 days a week, as well. And then we've seen some other folks that have fairly distributed teams, and they've made that work. So I think it's not a one size fits all approach in terms of where the team is located, really based on kind of personal preference of the leadership team.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely say the personal preference matters, but also I guess the team's function in the company. If they're working in a lab setting, or dealing with any kind of materials, hazardous materials or biologics, you can't do that from home. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
I don't think any company's going to pay for a lab to a home lab. Not yet.
Yeah. We're not there yet. Yes.
Yeah. So just to kind of reiterate this, are you seeing this trend towards more flexible on-demand services and contractors instead of full-time staff?
Yeah, I think the companies that have doubled down on this model, what they're observing is, look, there's a pool of 350,000 independent full-time consultants in biotech and pharma in the US alone. And these are not, kids out of college, but rather 65% of those folks have previously held positions of manager, director, VP, or C-suite. So as we struggle to find the right talent, and maybe we think about hiring someone full-time, perhaps prematurely, there's this massive pool of really top-tier talent that exists. Historically, we've only really had access to that talent pool through our personal networks. Like, we all know a handful of consultants or folks that have set up their own consulting shops, but obviously that doesn't scale, and it's a pain in the butt every time you have a need to reach out to your entire network. And so, figuring out how to reduce that friction while still enabling this sort of model has been a lot of fun, and we've seen, thankful to a lot of the partners that we work with that really have doubled down on this approach.
I appreciate that answer. So, as an industry insider, do you see what do you think are some of the underappreciated skills or roles maybe in biotech that you believe will be incredibly important in the future? So, for example, one thing that we've been seeing lately, especially if you have been reading the updates from this month's or last month's JPM healthcare event, AI is huge. There's a lot of opportunities there. VibeBio, we're also very much involved there too. So, are you seeing that as a skill set in biotech, or maybe some other things that I'm not aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to JPM, I was surprised by how many companies had included having an AI play as part of their pitch, right? Because, and I think there's so much opportunity as it relates to being able to leverage AI in what we do. We talked about how much risk there is in development, how few of the assets that we work on actually have commercial viability long term. So I think that's certainly really interesting. I think the question will come down to, how do we apply AI now versus how do we apply it 5-10 years from now? And I think there's interesting work happening in both senses. I think the integration of AI into some of, as an example, like data management platforms or monitoring platforms is going to be really interesting, because that has real world applications right now. And then now you think about the really large data sets that we have access to, and how do we select better experiments to run, taking into account all the success and failures that others have had, without it being a really painful research exercise to be able to figure that out. right? So making a lot of that data much more accessible to then inform how we conduct experiments, as an example, I think is going to be really, really valuable. Great to see NVIDIA, at JPM, NVIDIA CEO at JPM, and NVIDIA and Recursion have a partnership together. So I think really exciting to see how quickly biotech has adapted to the AI revolution that's underway, and leveraging large language models. I know Novartis is doing quite a bit of work in that as well. So I think that's certainly a skill set. The intersection of software engineers and folks with biotech backgrounds is certainly a skill set that we're seeing in high demand, and not a lot of available talent out there.
Interesting. What is some advice that you can share to those seeking a career in biotech, maybe younger people, maybe even looking to switch jobs within the industry?
Yeah. Look, I'd say there's a couple of things that come to mind here. I think for folks that haven't been exposed to biotech and pharma, often biotech and pharma get a really bad rap, right? Because of a lot of the politicized nature of drug pricing, et cetera, et cetera. But it is core to the future of human health. There's so many important drugs that have been delivered to patients that have resulted in diseases, the lifespans of patients with those diseases being fundamentally impacted in a positive way. So I think that's one thing that I'll say just about biotech as a whole for folks that aren't aware of the import of biotech and pharma as it relates to human health. I think the second thing, just for folks that are thinking about biotech or just early in their career, is I'd recommend going to a place where you have a bunch of opportunities and can be exposed to as much as possible as quickly as possible, so you can figure out what's your lane or what really excites you over time, and saying no to fewer things early in your career, so you have the privilege of saying yes to a handful of things that you're really excited about long term.
Good advice. I appreciate that. I think the community does as well. We're both in Boston, right? So Can you describe, in your perspective, how has the Boston biotech scene evolved over the last, few years, decade even?
Yeah. It's so different than it was a decade ago. I used to, originally biotechs only existed initially in like the Kendall Square area. Now, as a result of how many biotechs there are, they're everywhere from Lexington to Waltham to Burlington to Watertown. There's hubs that have come up all across the suburbs of Boston. And that's also drawn a lot of big pharma to the sector as well, to the Kendall Square area, for example, and Seaport area. I think it's a really exciting time. I think we're the number one hub as it relates to scientific innovation, perhaps tied with or a little ahead of San Francisco. But there's pockets of innovation that are popping up all across the U.S. But Boston, Cambridge, and San Francisco have certainly taken the lead, and it continues to accelerate. Now there's new ecosystems that are popping up, particularly for founder-led biotechs, to provide. Biotech's really, really hard, and the VCs in this area have been doing this for quite some time in terms of developing an ecosystem and having all the supporting staff that's required to get a biotech up and running. And particularly for founder-led biotechs, the access that they have now in this geography to other folks that have been there and done that and had successes and also had failures. I think there's a tremendous amount of knowledge sharing that's happening across biotech companies in this area, and I remain really, really excited by what's going on here, as well as in other locations across the U.S.
For sure, and just the real estate for life sciences companies here, that continues to grow. I see buildings popping up all the time, so it's a very exciting time. And I think given all the interest and the universities here, I think that's going to continue, like you said. Just wrapping up almost here, I have like my final couple questions. What kind of specific technologies do you see making the biggest impact on human health in the next few years, given all your experience seeing all these companies working on different projects? What are you seeing?
Yeah. So you mentioned, just uh, agnostic of the treatment modality, the application of machine learning is going to continue to be really interesting. I think we're just scratching the surface. So that's one. Antibody drug conjugates. We've seen a lot being done there. Obviously, gene therapy and precision medicine continue to be really exciting as some of those play out, and we have some commercial products now on the market. And I think combination products over time will be really interesting as well, with a precision medicine bend to it, if you will, of patients having therapies that are effectively N of one over time. And I know the rare disease community is really excited about that potential as well. But I think there's a lot more work to be done, specifically as it relates to rare diseases and the impact of, uh, let's say, the Inflation Reduction Act on just drug development as a whole. So I think it's an interesting time right now in biotech with some of the politics of it all, but also given the capital intensive nature of drug development and how capital markets have been responding. But certainly felt like JPM, there was a different excitement at JPM this year than last year, just given all the deal making that's been happening. So I think we're starting to be primed for a bit of a rebound here.
And that's really great to hear. We're really excited here at Vibe too. And, there's so much to look forward to in 2024. So I'm sure we'll talk again very soon. And I just wanted to thank you again for sharing your time with us today, and look forward to any feedback, comments from the audience as well. If you have any questions for Rahul, please feel free to ask. Again, Rahul, thank you so much for finally getting on the show, and looking forward to anything else you want to share with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this important work for the community. The more voices we have talking about all the exciting work is really, really important. So thank you.
Awesome.